Hello world, I'm Evan Gudmested, an instructor of application and web development at Rankin Technical College. In today's tutorial, we are going to cover what's referred to as the controller service repository pattern in an ASP.NET MVC application. I have here a Medium post from a few years ago, Tom Collings, where we talk about the controller service repository pattern. Obviously, this is a separation of concerns and an architectural pattern that's considered a best practice for separation of concerns. Model view controller already separates concerns pretty well, but even further, we separate out the controllers. You can see here to manage the REST interfaces. The service layer handles your business logic, and the repository, which handles the database layer, storage of the well, it's really just separating out the database tier and the database logic. And so this controller service repository pattern, we are going to build this application that also implements Entity Framework. And in Entity Framework, we have a database many-to-many relationship. And so, and this many-to-many relationship, you can see here the solution, as I'll pull up this application, is book and authors. And so we have a book table with a book can have many authors, and an authors table where an author can have many books. And so we have behind this application, we are also managing this many-to-many relationship in our database. And I can kind of go into my SQL Server momentarily and show us the database itself. And we have identity systems, so we can log in this application. But really what's behind here is we've got a book table, we've got an author table, and we've got the join table, the author book table. And so we start this application from scratch. We set up the database. We seed some authors and we seed some books for the data in our database. And then we build this application where we can manage our books. And so functionality wise, as I need to launch this application, as I closed it. So we'll go ahead and run this on localhost. I set up CRUD operation on my books. And so we can add new books. And this book can have one or many authors, again, many-to-many relationship. So we can create books. We can go to book details, modify our authors. We can edit the book, again, kind of a similar interface for editing a book. We can delete the book. We can do CRUD operations on our books. We also have data validation, okay? And again, I talk about the services tier. Specifically, this data validation is a business logic that we implement at the services tier. And then our repository tier handles our entity framework logic. And so the EF framework, all the database logic, so that if later on you say, hey, I want a Postgres database, you can change out the database logic by changing simply the repository tier. So again, a couple of things that we build here, and what's pretty cool about this one is that I set this up in this tutorial. If you follow along, we will, and there is a GitHub repo, but we will set up half of the code where we're able to do these operations on books. However, you will see I do not provide the same functionality on authors. And so I invite you, the viewer, to solve this problem. I demonstrate the code to do all of this on one half of the database relationship. On the books side, the challenge then becomes, can you finish the application by setting up the author's side of this relationship? So kind of have a fun little challenge in this one to set up CRUD operations on authors where you can add a new author, add books to that author from our existing books. Set up author details, be able to edit an author, be able to delete an author. And again, you've got a lot of code, my code to reference to do the challenge, and you can kind of learn by coding. So that's the exercise, that's the application. Hope you enjoy. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. If you guys are watching my screen, we're building ASP.NET MVC with an additional couple of layers. And really, you know, the new layers here are the service layer and the repository layer. And so in the service layer, you can kind of see we're going to put our business logic, anything that's unique rules to the business, including our validation rules, which up until now, we've always just put our business logic, including our validation rules, in the controller, and that gave them the name, you know, as you see, is called like a fat controller. It's not considered a best practice. So we're going to take that logic out and put it into a services layer. And then we're also going to have a repository layer, and that works a little bit closer to the database. And the big benefit there of the repository layer is that you really the theory is that you can switch databases themselves. Like if you went from a SQL Server database or a Postgres database or a Mongo database, you can switch between different databases, and then you're only changing that layer's worth of code. You don't have to refactor the whole application. You would just refactor the layer of the repository, and so it would simplify application refactoring if you have this repository layer. And then we're going to add in some additional query options, and you'll see these are just static classes, or these are just classes C# that are kind of boilerplate, that I don't think we need to focus on. Other than that, it's a normal MVC application. And so and what we will be demonstrating as well is a many-to-many relationship. And so we're just going to have the books and authors, right? So a book can have many authors, and an author can write many books. So you have a many-to-many. And today we're just going to spin up the database. And so we'll get the database built. We'll get the project structure built. And so I always start with an empty .NET Core application, of course with C#. And where it goes on my hard drive is this C drive. Just put this, I'm just going to put this on my desktop for now, just to kind of put it somewhere else. And then the project name, check this box here, and project name is book authors, something like that. .NET 10, all these good default settings are fine. Okay, so we're just going to do project setup and then database setup. So anytime the project setup, and we're doing an MVC app, so we can start off in program CS and kind of delete this default get request for our get endpoint, and to enable MVC, we add controllers with views to our services container. And so this will enable MVC controllers as well as API controllers. And actually, let's just put that order of operations here. We'll put that above line 7. And then static files, so we can have a www root kind of zoom in here. We'll have a www root folder for our images and our JavaScript and our CSS. I actually don't remember if we have user accounts on this one. Yeah, we're going to use the built-in identity just in case we can log in users and authorize different resources. So authentication, authorization. We use the default pattern, which is controller action and then optional ID. So this is our routing pattern, and this is a default. We spin it up to use the books controller to be the default. We don't have any controllers yet, but it uses the default pattern for routing. And then this line says to use the razor pages that will scaffold for identity. So we'll bring in some kind of default razor pages so users can log in, reset their password, all that stuff built into the identity system. So that's kind of some of the generic boilerplate for an MVC app using identity and identity razor pages. Of course, I kind of want to use just like a PowerShell and make all my folders here, but it's neither here nor there, whether we're using the GUI or the command line. This is controllers. We need a models, controllers, and views, right? So add for models, of course, another folder for views, and then inside here, inside views, we have a subfolder called shared. And then our views, we're just going to add some files called view imports. So razor view imports underscore view imports. And here, we'll come back to that because I need to create some namespaces first. I don't have these namespaces, but I guess the one thing here I can add is the tag helpers. So the .NET tag helpers for our razor views. Okay, before I lose my train of thought, let's add another item here called my view start. Razor view start. And then under shared, we're going to create our layout file, add new item. Okay, and in my class we've been using Tailwind, so we have to set up support for Tailwind, which includes a subfolder here for www root. And under there, we've got a CSS folder. And add an item called site.css. And I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit. All site CSS does is import Tailwind. Okay. So now, when it comes to the application dependencies, we're going to our NuGet package manager and we're going to browse. Search for fluent validation. Let's bring in fluent validation. So we're going to do some data validation using this library, and you bring in the library and the dependency injection extensions. Say that fast 3 times, 10 times. So those are the two. We're going to have some identity entity framework core. So Microsoft, and I got to select the latest stable. And then there's identity UI. Right here. Change it to the stable edition. And last but not least, I've got the entity framework. Microsoft Entity Framework Core, SQL Server. And .tools. Now if I go back into my project file, fluent validation, yes, 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 yes. I think that's all I need. Now there's a couple of items for Tailwind. Do you guys type the Tailwind? Do you guys type this every time, or you're just copying and pasting from your old? You're just copying and pasting, yeah. Yeah. Copy and paste it, yeah, that makes sense. So this just gets you to build your CSS file and minimize your site CSS, and it'll generate an output CSS for your Tailwind classes that are actually being used. And so now, if I go to Tailwind css.com docs, let's do an npm init. So we can have node dependencies. Let's install Tailwind. There we go. We already did the import. And now if I do a build, okay, it generates our output CSS. That's all I was looking for. So far so good. And in my layout file, I need to link to that output CSS. Okay. So we're not really going to get that far today where we hit a view, really setting up the models. Maybe we get to a controller. Definitely setting up the models. We got all of our dependencies brought in. We got our folder structure. I can add a few more folders here just for some folders that I will use. I'll add a folder called data. folder that says for the repositories, for the repository pattern. So we'll say repositories. We have a services layer, so let's add another folder for those. I have a folder for validators. And view models. Okay, now the models are the root of what we're doing today. So we'll create a new class, and again we have an author and a book. Notice it generates the namespace here. So now I can go back into my view imports. Book authors dot models. So I've got a class for my book and another class for my author. And again, what we're doing is creating a many-to-many between them. And so you start with the primary key, and I'll just start with book. So yeah, book ID or author ID, or just ID. A book has a title, which we'll initialize it to an empty string, and a book has a list of authors. So iCollection is the interface. Doesn't have to be a list, and in this case it's actually a hash set, which the difference between a hash set and a list is that a hash set enforces uniqueness, and so the idea is that you can only have the author one time. It's inside of a list. You can, instead of being able to store the same author multiple times, a hash set would enforce uniqueness. So you could initialize an author as a hash set that way.
But then what if like the author has different books?
This is saying that the authors have to be unique on a book. An author can still have different books. That's not going to create a conflict. Okay. This is to say, hey, for this book, let's just imagine a book, whatever the book is, you know, you can only list that author name once on that list of authors for that book. Okay, now this is referred to as a skip navigation property, skip nav property, right? So skip navigation, what is it skipping? It's skipping that join table in the middle, right? So what's happening between book and authors is that there is a middle table that is going to be called, again, you call it a join table, you call it a linking table, join table or a linking table. But essentially, when you have a many-to-many, it will auto-generate a third table for us. We'll have book, we'll have authors, and then we'll have book authors, which is that middle table. And so now on author, basically the same deal. We have an author ID, an author name, and an author has a list of books. So again, kind of the same thing. This particular author list of books is a hash set of books, technically. Therefore, you can't list that author B has the same, like you wrote the same book twice. It enforces that uniqueness. So this is code by convention, right? We're using the convention here to set up the many-to-many, because An author has a collection of books, and a book has a collection of author. This is code by convention. We're not using data attributes, and we're not using Fluent API, right? We're using convention to set up the relationship between these two entities. So this creates a many-to-many with a join table in between them. And so we are ready for our data context. Remembering that the data context, application, DB context, is kind of the middleman between your C# classes and the database. And so the parent is identity DB context, and that's not recognized right now because we need a using up top. So if we say using Microsoft Entity Framework Core, give this a second and it should, oh, actually there's one other. There's this one, Identity Entity Framework Core. Okay, so now we have our DB context inheriting from the right parent, but we're going to use this primary constructor to receive some options and then just pass those options up to the parent. So we just take that variable and pass the options up to identity DB context. And the method that we're going to use to seed our data, and I'm noticing I don't even have my DB set in here, but that's okay. So we've got on model creating. So this is the method we're going to use to seed some data. And the first thing I do, let's close my curlies correctly. Is pass model builder up to the parent on model creating. And now we can actually get into our seed data. So I've got 3 authors. Author ID of 1, 2, and 3. Stephen King, Peter Straub, J.K. Rowling. So I'm going to put 3 authors into my database. I'm going to put 3 books into my database. And this part where we are seeding the join table. Remember, there's a table in between. We need to basically say, okay, author ID of 1, you know, what books did Stephen King write? What book did Peter Straub write? What book did J.K. Rowling write? So you have to link them together here on this join table. So the way this is done is actually with that Fluent API, those methods that we discussed in the lecture. We discussed the pattern, which is a has with pattern. So I will write this out line by line and kind of walk it through it. Model builder entity. So we're going to start on the author side of the relationship. So an author has many books, a.books. And then you go to the other side with many, and so you're now on from the book's point of view. A book has many book authors, so has many with author, has many with many. You say using entity. This represents our join, and we're using the default join table name. We say J, join. That join has data. And this is the seed data for our join table. We put a semicolon at the end. And this is where you link the entities together. Now, there is a convention here. It's authors, plural, which again, it's the name of the entity plural, author's author ID, and book's book ID. Because we're following convention, that's very specific on what you have to name those columns. So author ID of 1 is, of course, Stephen King wrote The Shining. Author ID 1, Stephen King wrote The Talisman, so book ID of 2. Peter Straub is author 2, also wrote The Talisman, so you can see we've got 2 authors on book 2. And then author ID of 3 wrote book 3. So we kind of have our seed data ready to go. What we need to do is register this DB context file with our application. We haven't told our application about DB context yet. And so with that, we need a connection string, and that is configured inside of app settings. So there's a connection string setting in here that I will paste my connection string. So I just paste that in. And I'll just call this book authors. So this is the name of my database itself. So you can kind of see the long string of text to get my connection string in there. But the main thing here is that the database is named book authors. And our connection string here is named default connection. So that's the name of our connection string. So back in program CS, we can read that connection string. Right, so read that connection string into a variable. And then configure our DB context to use that connection string. And again, we are using SQL Server Local DB edition. That's the free edition. That's off of my Object Explorer right here. Here's my local DB. So read the connection string from the app settings, configure your DB context to use that connection string. And then there's one more one-liner that I like to use that makes it so that since this is using the identity system, the application DB context inherits from identity. Because we're using identity, I like to set it up so that you don't have to, just for these little demo projects, we don't require our users to confirm their account, because it's a one-liner that simplifies that. So, okay, now we should be good to go to use our DB context. And our models have been set up to represent the many-to-many, and we've seeded some data in that many-to-many. And so we should be ready for our first migration. Just call it DB init. Okay, so we can see we're creating a bunch of tables, roles, users, author. Here's author, author ID and name, book. And let's scroll. Here's my join table called author book. It's got author's author ID, book's book ID, and it's got 2 foreign keys. There's my 2 foreign keys. And it's 1 primary key, which is a compound primary key, so that looks correct. And so my database looks like it's ready to get going. If I run the update database command, there's my insert data. And it says done. Let's refresh my databases. I called it book authors. There's my book, there's my author, there's my author book. View data, view data, view data. So there's my 3 books, there's my 3 authors, and there's my join table joining the 2. All right, and so I've got the model set up. I've got the view import set up. Let me close. I can do a little bit of styling just on the layout page, and we can hit the landing page, and that'll be it for today. And so I'm already linking to my style sheet. On my page layout, I'm just going to copy in everything in between my body. It's actually a pretty minimalist page layout. You can see here my whole layout page is 35 lines. So we're looking at a body tag with Tailwind classes. We've got a nav tag. The nav tag links to your there's a couple of links in the nav bar to link to your books homepage, essentially your homepage for your books and your homepage for your authors. And so there's 2 links in the nav bar. There's a main section and a footer section. And then there's a section for optional scripts so that you can have each child page could have its own unique scripts. You don't need to put all the scripts all in the layout page. You can make it unique to the page. So there's a script section for optional scripts, and close the body. So that's layout. Now if I kind of go back here, we see that the books controller index method. So let's just make that. Let's just add a books controller. It's an empty controller. Books controller, plural. And let's just hit the books view. So we're going to add a subfolder under our views and add a view called index. And the title will just be books, and for now I'm not gonna send anything into it. So the books controller just sends the view to the client, and the view author, so we'll just say books web app, something. So you see the title is displayed. Okay, so we got books, web app. You see our links up here, little footer. Nothing fancy on the layout. In fact, I don't even have a collapsing nav bar or anything like that. But this is where I wanted to get today. Just the project structure set up, the database set up, the many-to-many relationship set up, and that join table, all with seeded data. So it's a good stopping point for day one. We'll sprinkle this throughout the week, and by the end of this, we'll have a nice application. And so the task at hand is to set up the project a little bit more with our services tier and our repository, I say tier, services layer and repository layer. And ultimately, we're setting this up, and I actually do want to pull data using those tiers. And again, I'll kind of explain their benefits as we go through them to pull up the home page. So we're going to get a listing. We're going to read operation, our list of books, in other words, along with their authors. And so we will read books with their authors. Nothing super special from that vantage point. It is a many-to-many, so that's a little bit different for us. And we're going to do it with these new layers in our application. And so in order to do this, implement this repository layer. And if you are in my class and you have our textbook, you can find repository layer code in chapter 12, like literally the iRepository interface, and the class that implements that interface is on page 495. And one thing to take away is that some of this code is like a template. You don't necessarily have to customize this code. You could take it as is, and that's nice. And so you don't have to customize some of this. You can take it as is. So we're going to start with some utility classes before we even get to the repository layer. So in the infrastructure, and again, these are just classes that you could take verbatim. Let me add a folder called infrastructure. And inside of here, I'm going to make two classes, one called query options. Add a class called query options. And we're going to add another class called query extensions. And so these classes are also in the textbook. And let me start with query options. So I have some notes to kind of explain query options. I think of this as the class that'll hold your settings of your link query. And so this will actually help organize our code a little bit. So this is the settings class, right? And when I talk about settings, like a where clause, which will return only books published after 2020. A sort clause, sort by title A to Z. Order by price, high to low. So these are all essentially link queries. So what you're going to see in here, and this is quite different, the syntax of this, the methods and the properties that are in here are working with link queries. And so this will help write and more efficient link queries. So again, I take this verbatim as far as like it's literally something you guys can copy and paste. This is pretty unique here because when you're looking at this is a link expression, and so the return data type on this property it belongs and the reason that's not evaluating or compiling is because we need to make this a generic. So type T, where T is a class. So you're going to see how we're going to store link query settings in a query options class. And then query extensions, and again, you can copy and paste this code. This will apply our options to our query. So this query extensions class actually does the work of applying the options. And so it says without these two helpers, you guys have seen link queries up until this point where you write your link query like this. But what happens is those queries could be found multiple times in your controllers. And so with these two classes, with these two helpers, notice we can store our options in a variable, and then we can add those settings, and then we can apply the options to our query. And so I have a note. Why use this pattern? It offers code reusability. You could pass the same object to different methods. Flexibility. Only set the options you need. Others are ignored. And cleaner code. Keeps the query logic organized in one place. And so again, it's a little bit of legwork to stand these up. You're copying and pasting these classes. But it does help with organization is what it boils down to. So this is a static class. This is a static class with a static method. So you're going to copy and paste this static method into this static class. Now this is an extension method. So you're going to notice that we are extending the iQueryable interface. Therefore, any class that implements the iQueryable interface will have this apply options method available to it. So we're essentially adding on a new method to the iQueryable interface. Okay, so we're going to use these two classes, query options and query extensions, in our repositories. Okay, so now in our repositories folder, we're going to spin up the interface and the class for iRepository. So we're going to add a class. This will just be called repository. And above the class, we can put an interface, public interface called iRepository. Now this is going to be a generic, so type of T, where T is a class. So you can have a repository of book, you can have a repository of author. Okay, now keep in mind this iRepository is going to implement this interface. So we're going to have a bunch of methods. So these are just database methods. These are get author by ID. These are get all authors. These are the methods that repository will have to implement. So we are just defining method signatures here. The one that we start with today, and I might need to come back and define another, is we're going to be able to get all in an asynchronous format, passing in our query options that we just sent. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to get all of our books. So when we have a repository of type book, we'll be able to call get all async. And this repository, this will be a repository of book type T that implements iRepository, where T is a class. And right away it says, hey, you've got one method that you must override. So let's go ahead and implement that interface. Now in the method signature here, get all async, we can mark this as virtual. What that does is it just says if you have a child that this method can be overridden when you mark this method as virtual. And this is where we ultimately call our entity framework toList async method. So notice what we're doing here is we're returning our table, which I have to do a little bit more with DB set. Applying the link options, and then getting the list out of the database. Now, this iRepository needs to inject our application DB context called context. And there's 2 lines here to set up the underscore context equal to the value that was passed in. We could probably shortchange that. We could name that a little bit differently. But we're also setting the table type. The DB set, that is your entity, your database entity. So we're setting the table type with the generic type T. So if it's a repository of author, a repository of book, you're setting that here. And let's see that I've got the imports using, that looks good. And let's mark this as async because we got an await. So we mark this task as async. Okay. You know, I talked about abstraction and how it's pretty difficult to make things more and more abstract. What this allows us to do is if you ever refactor the database, you know, all of these methods, these entity framework methods, the theory is that you could just come into the repository itself and change your database access logic all in one place. And so all the database update records, delete records, read records, you know, by changing this repository, you can refactor your database access logic. And so right now we're using entity framework and we're using SQL Server, but if you change your database, you just have to change your repository logic. So it is also the case that this is not something that you have to do on all your apps. In this class, you guys have been writing, you know, CRUD apps in this class for like a month or 2 now, and you've never worked with a repository tier. So when to skip this, if you have a small app, like this is just extra overhead. This is not by any case something that you should do for every application. But again, why would you use this? It's one place for all your database code, so refactoring becomes easier. It's also easier to test when you separate out the logic. And so, you know, I guess the takeaway from this is that you don't need to do this for all the apps that you ever write. This is probably overkill for any small app that you do, including this one. This is definitely a little bit overkill, but it's good to learn this pattern for larger apps. Okay, so right now we've got a repository with database access logic that takes in some link options and applies those options, and then gets any particular entities out of the database, calling this entity framework toList async. And because dbset implements, if I can control click, dbset implements the interface, that's why we can call this static method of apply options from our extension method right here, right? iQueryable interface. Okay, so we got the repository layer set up to get all of our entities. Now the next thing to do is on top of the repository layer sits our services layer. And so you got essentially on the bottom of the stack, you've got the database, and then you've got the repository layer, and on top of that, you got services, and the controller works with the services. The controller handles HTTP gets and puts and deletes and all the HTTP methods. And so let's go to services. And we are working with books first, so I'm going to make a book service. Okay, so in the services folder, add a class called book service. Above this class, we will have the interface. This is public interface iBook service. And for now, we're just going to have one method. Get all books with authors async. Book service has a primary constructor where we bring in the repository. So iBook repository, and it implements iBook service. Now iBook repository needs to have that namespace brought in. And so let's see. Using books, authors, repositories. Book authors dot repositories, iRepositories in there. Oh, iBook repository. We need the iBook repository. Dare I forget the other class. I need to finish this demo off, right? This is just the generic repository, but we don't have a book repository yet. So can't work with the service until we finish that off. So let's make up a book repository. Public interface iBook repository implements iRepository of book. We need to add the models folder up there. For now, the one method, get book with authors async. Takes in the DB context, implements the interface, get book with authors async, It's an async method. Okay, so step one, make the generic repository interface, make the generic repository, then make the specific book repository that implements the repository of type book in this case. And this takes in an ID. Which is then used in our link query. Let's go back to our book service, implements iBook service. Now that's a recognized type here. I don't think we end up using this get book authors with async with that ID. Let's implement that interface. So back on the book service, get all books with authors async. Here's ultimately where we're going to use that options is our query options, including the authors, order by the book's title, and async await. And last but not least is our book repository, which is an underscore. So there's our field. So I just initiate the underscore book repository. So you kind of go through the down the rabbit hole here from the service into the book repository. The book repository, calls repository, and now we're ready to work with the book service in the controller. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a breakpoint so we could just trace this through the woods here. So back in our controller, books controller, it is a very lean controller. So our books controller inherits from controller. Let's go ahead and create an instance field for our book service. Primary constructor, iBook service. Underscore book service equals book service. And then you make this async. And this needs to be a task. Action result. Okay, so let's put in a breakpoint, and we don't have the view spun up yet, but I want to use a breakpoint to just kind of traverse down the rabbit hole. And it's also the case that I have not done my dependency injection correctly. So let's not forget one more curly brace here. build. So after here, I'm going to register my repository. I'm going to register my service so they can be injected into my controllers. Build it again. Okay, we hit our breakpoint. So now we go to book service. Book service makes an options object that is a query options data type, query options of type book. We say the book should include the authors. That add include, again, this is in the query options class. Add an order by. Now we call the book repository, get all async, passing in those options. Now it's going to crash. Hold on. You can see there's a count of 3. So it did get my 3 books out of the database. And so book service called repository So now that we got the 3 books coming out of the database and they come with their authors, the last thing to do is go into the index and style it using Tailwind. So if I go to my views, authors, index, or excuse me, books index, not authors index, books index, books index. Here we have essentially our list of books, title which says our books, just kind of walk through this markup together, right? So you can kind of see up here there's a link to create a new book. We don't have that functionality yet, but here we're looping through our books. Here's a big table, and in this table we got a header that says title, authors, and actions, right? So the book title, the authors of that book, and the actions are the CRUD actions in the 3rd column. And now we're looping through each of our books and displaying that book's title. We're looping inside of here. We have a nested loop, and for each book there is a list of authors. So we're looping through and showing all those authors on each book. And then in the 3rd table cell, here's our links to get the details, edit, and delete operations of a book. Now if I play that, here we could see our first book, second book, and third book, that third book having the two authors. Now obviously none of our actions are working. Here's our button to add a new book. Okay. Now I wanted to make this read operation as simple as possible. Obviously the next steps, we're going to continue to flush this out of edit and delete. I am not sure at this point, this book service, we didn't really hit, not the book service, but the book repository. Get book with author async does have one reference, but that's itself. So this is not used yet. In fact, I'm just kind of curious here. The application is live. Now the book repository was needed because I hit a breakpoint where the book repository was injected into my book service. So iBook repository was needed, but this is what's confusing me at the very moment. I know I wrote this, but I'm just following the pattern. So that's something that will need to be flushed out, because it doesn't seem like we're using that at this point. iBook repository is a repository of type book. Huh. Let me spend 5 minutes troubleshooting this. Paused. Okay, where I've landed is I think I wind up using this in the future, even though it's not implemented now. So even though we're not using it now, I'm going to keep it in here as we continue to build this out. So, step one was to be able to do a read operation. That's really where I wanted to get today. And then we will continue down this rabbit hole working with edit, update, and delete operations. So we'll continue those tomorrow. All right, we are recording, and I want to start today with a little bit of an explanation because I forgot something as I was coding yesterday. I forgot to explain something. I know I didn't explain some things well, and so I wanted to circle back and offer a high-level explanation of a little bit of the code that we wrote. Notice that I have both in my repository. I have a repository class, repository CS, with an interface and a class. This class is a repository of T. And when I think of repository of T, we are talking about CRUD operations really on a single entity. And so we're going to be filling out this repository of T with other operations. But when I think of single entity CRUD operations, that's what this repository class is good for. So you can have a repository of book, you can have a repository of author, and then you have operations on your books and operations, CRUD operations on your authors. So the book repository kind of threw me off yesterday because I forgot why I did this. The book does not have this additional class. So in the textbook, we simply use repository of book. And then you could do CRUD operations. But keep in mind, our book is not just a single entity, it's a many-to-many relationship. And so what I have here is I've created a book repository that inherits from repository of book. So all of the methods, as we understand about inheritance, all the public methods from the repository of book, all those CRUD operations will be inherited by my book repository. And then what I get to do is I get to add additional new methods that really support the many-to-many relationship. Okay, so what I didn't do well yesterday, I think, is a little bit of explaining, because I started to write some code here, then I realized I wasn't using that code, and why is that going on? Kind of deal. I hope I did a basic explanation. Again, if I was doing CRUD operations on just a book, and that book was just a single entity, it didn't have other relationships to support, I could just use repository of book. But because I've got some many-to-many relationships, as I code this out, we'll bring in these other relationships, and I've got this child class that inherits from repository of book. Okay, so with that being the explanation, again, I think it's going to make more sense as we continue to code this out. And what's on the agenda for today is adding new books. And so it's a little bit of code, not a ton of code. When we go to add a book, we can optionally add book authors. And so that's what we're going for. If I kind of launch where it's at, all we're really doing is we have an index page with our books on it. And we've got a big button that says add book, add new book. Okay, and so as you can see, a book really just has a title and it has a list of authors. It's a pretty simple object. Pretty simple object. And so when we click add new book, you can envision the form. The form is just going to be a text box. But we also need to provide the authors that we can add to a book. Like these are the authors that are in our system. Let us, select, and checkboxes would be the appropriate control, right? Since you can select multiple authors, probably a checkbox kind of control, bunch of checkboxes. So obviously this doesn't work because, well, we don't have books create. So this would be books controller create method. And we can kind of start there, but instead of starting with books create, now we have repository and we have a services layer. So let's kind of work from the bottom up. Let's work from the repository layer first. And let's open up the repository. So in our interface, really we've got the get all async. Again, these are CRUD operations. So get all of a type, and this would be add async would be adding something new. If I save that, of course, this no longer compiles because we need that add async method down here. As I did below, virtual async. Virtual means that you can override this method and any of its children, and asynchronous so that we can call async await. We can call await methods. And then we're just going to write this is entity framework, EF. We pass in the entity, whatever entity type is, and we just call the entity framework method add async that belongs to our DB set type. So we're adding it, and then we have to save. Now this save async, this is a method that multiple, we need to write this method, and we're going to call it several times. So this save async really is just another method beneath here. It's a virtual async, returns a data type of task, and this just calls save changes async against context. Again, context being our database representation. So add it to the table, and then save the database. So that's at the repository layer. Now back to the service layer. Keep in mind that the service layer, this is where we put in custom business logic. The main thing that I want to put here, that I'm going to add in here to this demo, is I'm going to add in validation, right? We're going to have our validation logic in the services layer because that's validation logic is going to be specific to our business, if you will, or to our use case. So kind of go to my book service. And let's begin, because we need a method in here. So let's kind of take a look at the method header. Now there is a new class here called create book async that is a service result. Service result is a class that I add to our services. So let me just get this to compile. So under services, I'm going to add a class. Now this is the generic service result. So this is another utility class. This is the class service result, and this is the same class that takes a generic interface. Now, this has to do with fluent validation. And I see I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself with this method, because what I want to do is I want to build this piece by piece. Of course, you have to code the get method before the post. And so this book service, really we start dealing with data validation on a post. And so I need to code the get method before I get to here. So I'm gonna kind of comment out what's erroring on me, and let me come back to this file. I'm going to close. Close service result and keep book service open. So I'm going to go back to books controller. And public async task create. So in this view, in this create view, I do need all of the authors. And so the first thing I do inside of this create method, because I end up sending these authors to the view. So all authors. But in order to get all authors, we need an author service. And right now we only have a book service. So we do have this get all books with authors. Now I need to make an author service just to get all the authors. And so under services, add class public interface iAuthor service. Task enumerable of author, get all authors async. Again, that's what I'm trying to call. Get all authors async. And we need a using statement to recognize author. So now that's recognized. The service implements the iAuthor service with that method. Now this guy uses a primary constructor. That brings in the author repository, doesn't quite exist yet. Just as book repository, we need to create an author repository. Am I getting hit up on Discord? Or is that one of you guys? Deshaun, is that you?
It was me. My apologies.
No worries. Okay, so here's our author repository. These are the unique methods, but really I don't think we even need these yet. What we do need to inherit, application DB context called context, and we inherit from our repository of author context, implement these methods. Again, these methods aren't going to be implemented at the moment. We'll come back to these. But because our author repository inherits from a repository of author, when we use an author repository, we can now get all authors, right? So that's kind of the trick. You need this author repository to inherit from repository of author to get all authors, because again, repository has a get all async. So we should be able to come back here. iAuthor repository should now be a recognized type. You guys have benefited at least somewhat from me teaching material over the course of my career many times. And so I'm picking up a difference on my teaching style on this one because I haven't taught this very many times. So there's a little bit more of like, maybe I'm not as efficient as teaching this, and I apologize for that because I'm a little bit newer to it. But we're getting through it, and hopefully,
This is perfect.
well, I appreciate that. We're getting there. Okay, so we have an author repository. This is a variable that we could use. I don't know why I cluster my code with underscore author repository. I frankly don't need that, but man, that's where I've been going with it. So get all authors async. We simply make this a async method so that we can await. We're going to return this data. author repository, get all authors async. No, get all async. Let's see. Get all async. Now this needs to be task IEnumerable author. So let me go back. It doesn't want the get all async. So if I go to my repository, here's get all async. Okay, so notice in my repository, I have a get all async with query options. There's another version, an overloaded version of this method that I have not written that does not take options. And so it's very similar method signature in my repository. So the method header on the interface is just get all async, no parameters, one parameter, no parameters. So if we save that, we implement that interface. Here's the new method right here. And return await db set toList async. Okay, so one has some link options that you can pass in. One just says give me all without the options. So now this just should be get all async, not get all authors async. Oh, wait a minute. This is books control. Okay, we're almost there. We're almost back to the controller. So here's the repository. The repository service calls author repository, get all async, so that should work. We don't need these yet. This calls get all async. So this is an async method, get all authors async. So we're trying to call that method, and it's not happy with underscore author service because I don't have author service in here. So author service is not a recognized type in my book controller. So I need to inject it into my book controller. So book controller, comma, I author service called author service, private read only. There we go. But in order to inject the author service, I need to add in author service, author service, and builder author repository, author repository. Okay, so starting at the controller, we pass in the author service, and we get all the authors. That was a whole lot of code to get all the authors. Now my create view is going to have a view model. It's going to be a book view model. So let's add a book view model. And so if you think of the view, you might need a book ID, public int book ID. You need a book title, public string title, get set. You might need a list of ints for the selected author IDs. Autofill is killing me. Get out of here. We can initialize that list to an empty list. A list of authors that are the available authors and current authors. We can initialize this to string empty. Get rid of that green squiggly. So obviously the selected one, that's going to allow, you know, the current authors is definitely different than the available authors, which is different than the selected authors. So there's little distinctions between all three of those that we can use. So now back in our books controller, we get all the authors. In our view imports, let's also add a using book authors view models so that our view model data type will be recognized. Here's our view model, is a new book view model. And our available authors oh my, I'm writing this in the wrong method. I'm doing this on the index method, my bad. Here on the index method, we just get all of our books and send that. Here's our view model. On the create, this is our, of course, this is our HTTP GET. Get all the authors, put the available authors into a book view model, send that view model to the create view. Let's go ahead and add a view called create. And then we can get to the point where we can post a new book. Show. Of course, this is a model book view model. See, that should be a recognized type. Title of create book. I'll quickly go through. I'm just going to dump some HTML on the screen. Outer div around the whole thing, no big deal. We got the first div, which takes us home, right? If you don't want to do anything, this takes you back. Here's a big back button. There's a div underneath that with a heading that says create a new book. Here's a form tag that'll post to the create method, so we have to create that post. Here's the controls for our title attribute along with validation controls for the title. Anti-forgery token helps with cross-site scripting security. So a little security razor tag there. So here's your book title. Again, we're creating a new book. So what's the book title? Here we loop through all of our available authors. We read all the available authors and put the authors into a checkbox. For each author and available authors, make a checkbox. Notice the name attribute is selected author IDs. That's an array. So that's selected author IDs. That's an important keyword. That was on our view model, right? Selected author IDs. That's how you populate this list, which underneath the hood of a list is effectively an array. If you look underneath the list data type, all lists are in fact arrays. So that's how you put the selected author IDs into a list and populate that list. The value attribute, author ID 1, author ID 2, so on and so forth. So that's the number that gets put into that array. And you also display the author's name next to that checkbox. A cancel button and a create book button that submits to the post. I mean, this is a submit button that runs the create post method. So let's see if we get our authors inside of checkboxes. I might have to comment out. Yeah, I thought we're going to come back to you. We're going to come back to you. Build. This was dealing with data validation. I wasn't ready to talk about this today. That's a whole nother pattern that I'll introduce here later. Okay. It's ugly. Why so ugly? But it's there.
That's funny. Closing the command prompt and reopening it.
You know, let's try. Let's just try reloading. That might be it. Yeah. No. Interesting. If I just kind of show you from my other demo one,
There's no
What's on?
it's ugly. Let me show you what it looks like on my other one. It's a lot nicer. My Tailwind classes.
Yeah, I was about to say, is it not pulling in Tailwind?
Well, it is because my.
The buttons look.
Let me look at this page. The first page is all.
Buttons look what? The buttons look how they should.
Yeah, that.
Yeah, look and look down here, right? The buttons look good. So it's definitely got some tailwind going on.
Yeah.
Did you save it?
Oh yeah, it's saved. Well, yeah, like this class of focus ring indigo on the checkbox. Let's just see if that class is even being applied. Not that we need to. So here, there it is, focus text indigo.
My bad.
Which one are you looking at?
Sorry.
Not, yeah, rounded input. Interesting. So I see the text indigo. Anyways, let's just continue. I'll come back. I'll circle back to it. I'll find it. Not to worry for right now. So we got to the point where we can put in a new book, and now we need to post. So in my books controller, now we get to write a post. So the method header looks like this. And the attributes above now we take in the view model, right? So that view model should be passed in from the view. And we should have a book title. So here's an object, a new object, saving the book. And here is the method for the book service, create book async. And let's factor this in. Create book async is in book service. Book service inherits correctly. So create book async is the method. Let's implement that interface. This needs to be an async virtual. Actually just async method so that we can await book repository, add async book. I was trying to Let's just see if I can return without using the service results. Okay. I'm trying to shortchange the validation for now. Come back to it. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that. Cannot implicitly invert void into a book. And so this is expecting almost like it's expecting a book back. If I'm reading that right. Let me ask old AI. And here. What do I need to return from my create book in book service class? If I go to the controller, it expects some sort of result, which is what this service result is, but I was trying to not bring that in. If AI says I need to bring it in, then I'll bring it in. It does want a service result. It does want to, you return like an okay message is what it does. Okay, so here's in my results.
Deshaun, are you okay?
I'm watching something. Oh yeah. What am I watching? TV mode. There's nothing on the screen.
So I'm going to flush this class out. So we have service result and service result generic, so that I can return in book service. And I need to offer an explanation behind all of this. Book repository, add book. Return service result, book, okay. And again, this is not using data validation, but this is returning an okay status that the book was added.
This is repository pattern, right?
Yes. This
Around
is,
the entity framework.
yeah. So create book async, send the book in, add it async to book repository, which comes from this add async right here, and this saves it ultimately using entity framework. And so to go back to the book controller, we now can proceed So this sends us back to the index method. So add the book, go back to the index method, one more curly brace. Let's put a breakpoint in right here.
Sorry.
Add new book.
Here it is.
Gudmestad book just wasn't being nice for a minute. And I'm going to say that this guy wrote my book. Hit the create book. We hit the post. The title is in fact Gudmestad book.
Can you choose multiple authors for this or no?
Yeah. Yep. Create the book async. Sends us to the service layer. We call the repository layer and add the book. That calls the add async entity framework. Calls the save async method that we wrote down here, which saves it to the database. If I just click continue, now we get Gudmestad book. It did not tag along the authors, so I obviously left that part out. Let me fix that. There's an if statement that I left off in my controller that looks like this. This requires another method called update book authors, where you pass in the book ID and the selected author IDs. I think that's what you were getting at, Anna, when you're like, hey, what about the authors? You got to be able to select multiple authors. I had not accounted for my authors yet. So we create the book, and that saves it to the database, and then we update the authors. Which that goes in here in my author service. So here you take in the book ID or the author ID and a list of book IDs. In this case, well, hold on, let me back up. Book controller, update book authors. Update, no, I got that wrong way. I got to update book authors. So that's in the book repository. Update book authors async. It's actually some, whoa, where'd you go haywire? Async. There's some important, many-to-many logic going on in here that I'm going to have to talk about. But before I do that, I need to bring this method back in and this method back in. Get book with authors. So you get book with authors so that you can call it here. So we get the book. Okay, so get book with authors includes all the book authors. So we get an individual book, we clear out the authors, and then we update the authors using a set method. All right, so we clear the authors and then we clear the authors on the book. Here, await your database set the author table where the author ID contains the author ID that's passed in. So you're getting all the authors, right? So here's your author IDs list. Here you're getting them out of the database, and then you're adding each author to the book. So if I kind of annotate this, remove all book authors, and then add the selected authors back to the book. So this gets the authors with their selected IDs, and then this adds the authors to the book. Right? So this is the many-to-many logic that I was kind of hinting at why we needed the book repository class, because there's some many logic that is right here, right? A book has many authors, so clear those authors, select the authors, add the authors back on, and then you call save async, and save async was a method. Where does save async come from? I think we added it to the repository. Yeah, the repository has save async, right? Which saves the database. So I'm going to hold off on this guy because that will cause that to compile. Books controller. Okay, now we have this method, update book authors async. Update book authors async. Let me go back to the book service. Book controller, book view model. I don't care who you are, there's so many files here. It is so easy to get crossed. Book repository is what I'm looking for. Update book authors async. There's an int and a list. So we pass in an int and a list. And it says iBook service does not contain that. Accepting iBook service could be found. Update book authors async. Public async. Let me troubleshoot this. I'll send you guys on break. Okay. Simple solution, I just was skipping a tier. I was going from the book service right to the repository. So I got to go into my, I have to go into my book service and add the update book authors async. Now that method is here. Now I can call the repository. Okay, so we should be able to wrap this up, at least for today, just by looking at the solution to the problem. So the problem was if you look at the data type of book service, this method is attached to the book service. Well, I wrote that method not in the book service, I wrote it in the book repository. So you got to pass it through the service, right? So I just had to write this method to accept the ID and the author IDs and then pass it through to the repository. And so I kind of skipped the tier there, which was the problem is I sent you guys on break. It took all of like 10 seconds to troubleshoot, but I just wanted to troubleshoot it. So with that being said, we go from the controller. If there's new selected author IDs, then we update through the service to the repository. Again, clear them all, select the authors, add the authors to the book, save it, and that save async comes from right here, which is repository. So I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4 files ultimately to get this to work, and then send you home. So let's start without debugging. Let's add a book. Let's add some authors to that book and see that does take effect. So my last book, it added, but it didn't have the authors. Again, I'm dealing with the styling. This has got to be a browser thing, but there we go. Gudmstead Book 2 does in fact have its authors. And so yeah, probably of all the different chunks of code, the one that stands out to me a little bit is this one right here, that specifically interacts with the many-to-many relationship, because you have a book with many authors. You remove those authors, you select the authors, you add each individual author back in to the book, and then you save the changes. So now we have that going. We have the read operation, we have the create operation. Now we have the edit and the delete and the data validation to cover, as well as I kind of just hand waved my code chunk on this, not the book service, but the service results. I kind of just hand waved over this. I didn't explain it. I owe you an explanation on that, but I want to revisit that tomorrow. And we'll get that. That was 55 minutes to do create. Tomorrow we will continue. All right. So the task at hand today is an update operation. We're going to update our books. And so, man, as I code this, you guys are probably like me. There's so many files and there's so many files, just places to look for your code. I tried to kind of bring it down. We got our program CS. the controller is where the HTTP request comes in. From the controller, we work with the book service. So we got a book controller, we got a book service. We have an author service, as we will need to work with our author service as well because books have authors, so we need to work with both. And we got our book repository. So kind of just, okay, start with a few files. And when we look at our books controller, of course, we have our books as they load. That's going to be the index method. Yesterday, we created a new book, which requires a get page. So you kind of land on the create view through this method. And then there's a form to post a new book. So we got that working yesterday. And so we're going to add 2 new methods today, starting at the controller. And I guess we'll work our way down. I tried going from down up, and now I'm going to try up down and kind of see which way works better from that vantage point, if either. So we're going to start with our HTTP GET. And this is an edit method. So let's public async task of I action result. Edit, it takes in an ID. We're going to basically, this ID is going to be coming in through the route, right? So if we look at our program CS, we see the ID can be appended to our segments here in our routes. So the ID should be passed in via the route. And the first thing to do is we need to go ahead and perform a read operation. We need to get the book with the individual book, right? So if I kind of scroll down to the book service, this gets all the books. We got a create book, we got an update book. But what we're going to do is we're going to make a get book by ID async. So here we're writing a new method to pass to the service layer, and then we're ultimately going to pass that on to the book repository layer. So now that we have this method header, we need to implement said method in the book service. And really, again, all we're doing here is calling the repository right here. So here's get book by ID, sending the ID through. Call this a kind of a wrapper. We're just going to go ahead and call the book repository get by ID async. Again, the service layer is where we can add invalidation, and we will do that. So for right now, this is just overhead, right? But eventually we'll put some logic into this layer. So we need to, in our book repository, get by ID async. Now, the question is that just a generic, that's just a generic CRUD. So we can, this is going to go all the way back to the repository, get by ID async, right? So if I kind of go back to the service, we're just calling get by ID async. This is generic enough. We put this at the repository level. Not the book repository, at the repository level. And here's our get by ID async at the repository level. And here all we need to do is return the entity. No. Let's mark this as virtual and async. db set find async. So this actually hits the database table, finds by ID, returns that up a level to the repository get by ID async. Therefore, the book repository inherits from repository of book. So any book repository should now have that method. And therefore my service, okay, we mark this as async. Now that's working. So that's get by ID async. Okay. So now we're ready to call my service from the controller. So hopefully you can kind of see the flow as we've done this a couple of times. I think you doing this yourself obviously will connect the dots. But so the first thing we do here get book with authors. Well, silly me, I just wrote the get book by ID, not get book with authors. So in the, let's go down that path, get book with authors. Which makes sense, not just getting the book, but you're also getting the book with the authors. Now, that is specific enough. That is a unique method that belongs in our iBook repository. So here, that's not just a generic CRUD on a single entity. Getting a book with an authors, that requires, oh, we already have get book with authors. That's good. iBook service. So we have it at the book repository level, but we need it at the book service level. We don't have it at the book service level. So the method is get book with authors async. Get book with authors async. I'll mark this as async. Pass it through. Okay, from the controller to the service to the book repository. Pass the ID through. I do want to mention, if you really wanted to, instead of just writing this link, you could have a query options class here. You could refactor this with that, but that gets us back to that compiling. We say, hey, if the book is null, return an error not found. So we get the book with the authors. We get all of our authors. We wrote get all authors async already. So get the individual book, get all the authors. We're going to populate a view model to send var view model to the view, new book view model. So obviously this is coming from our database lookup. So we're doing an edit operation. So our book should have an ID. We look up the book. We populate the book ID in the view model using the book's ID. Should also have a title. Available authors is all authors to list. So there's all authors from our database lookup. This is an interesting one. Selected author IDs is our book that we looked up. Authors, so that's our list of authors on the book. We select only the author ID and we convert the IDs to a list. And then we send that view model to the view. So that way the checkbox is checked. If there's already a selected author ID, we'll check the box, and we'll also just populate all the available authors and a bunch of checkboxes. So this will get you the checkboxes. This will check the checkboxes of the existing authors. So get the book, get all the authors, populate a view model, send it to the view. We don't have that view. So let's create under views, books, we have an edit view, add a view, so our model is a book view model. Page title is edit book. Again, not to just dump it, but I will, walk through it. You're going to notice this looks pretty similar. We got kind of an outer wrapper div. Our first link, we just have a back to book link that takes you back to the index page. So obviously this is just a big back button, right? That's an anchor tag. Underneath the back button, we got the rest of the page. A heading, an H1 that simply says edit the book. Here's a form that allows us to post to an edit method. So obviously when we click submit, we're going to run a post method that we don't have created yet. We're storing the book ID. Obviously, when we post it, that ID is going to be necessary in the post. So that's an important piece of information that you leave that hidden field out and this code will not work. We have the book title. We loop through all of the available authors and generate the checkboxes. And then we have a ternary. If the selected IDs contains this individual's author ID, then we mark this checkbox as checked. So we got a simple, nice little ternary thing here, checking the box if the selected author ID contains the author ID of the author in the loop. Another cancel button and your submit button. That should get us to the point when we click the edit button that we should be able to view the form and get ready to post it. So let's boot this up and see what breaks. Okay, Gudmundstad Book 2. If I click on Edit, Gudmundstad Book 2 is in the title. It is correctly checking the boxes of the authors that I have checked, right? So these are the two authors that we set when we created the book. And when I click on Edit, there we go, Add New Book. Whatever little quirks Tailwind was having yesterday, we never quite diagnosed the problem, but it doesn't seem to be happening today. I did have a couple students with some other quirkiness. It was kind of similar. We wondered if it was an issue with something behind the scenes. Regardless, it does look like our edit book operation is working. So now we just got to wire up the post method. If I go back to my books controller, HTTP post, public async task. Let's see, when I post, the signature is still the same. Task of iAction result. Edit. We take in the ID. And we also have a book view model. Oh. Now the ID again will be part of the route, but we also will have the ID in the view model. So we'll have it in two places. So the first thing's kind of a, hey, if somehow the ID doesn't equals the view model ID, somehow we got our wires crossed, return not found. Let's create a new book with the ID and the title. So this is the updated title, right? So view model title has the new title. We haven't touched the authors yet. And here's a new method that needs to be written. Update book async. So that goes down to the book service. Update book async. And save that. Bring in the interface. Update book async. Again, this is where we're going to do some validation. But for the time being, we're going to pass it down to the repository. We need to update async. We need to bring that method in. Update async goes all the way to the repository. We don't go, because again, that's a generic method. So, and then assuming all that works, again, we got to touch on this a little bit more. Return service result. This is a task of type service result. It's kind of like your HTTP status code 200. Think of that as a status code of 200 for now. So now in my repository, we get to write update async. And it belongs in repository because it's generic enough that it's belongs here. So here's my update async method, and we mark this as virtual async. And we do underscore DB set update and await save changes. Okay, so the book service calls update book async, passes in the book. And then, so we did update the book, but that did not update the authors. Notice I'm kind of treating those separately. This is a method that we wrote yesterday, update book authors, passing in the ID and the selected author IDs. So that method again belonged in book repository, update book authors, and here's the logic that we wrote yesterday for that. Now, book controller, await, back here, book controller. All we do then is we send them back home. So that gets that to compile. There's our post. Let's see what breaks. Doesn't build, of course. Okay, so the book service, I didn't bring that in. Let's update book async in the book service. I left one piece out. Update book async.
I think you accidentally put that under the update book authors. Like right, the method right under that. I think you flip-flopped it on.
Oh, I flip-flopped them. Oh, I think you're right. This logic there we go. And then all we did here, I needed to leave that untouched. And then book repository needs update book authors async. Oh, return. And this needs to book repository. Oh, update book async has a just a task. And it's just wait. Thank you for catching my crossed wires. Okay, if I uncheck Peter Straub, save changes, there we go. Can check all three. Save changes, Gudmestad book 20, save changes. Cool. You know, I think as we're getting used to it, right? You just got to get used to the pattern, is what I would say. Get used to all the layers, and I do understand where it's like literally this book service right now doesn't offer us a whole lot of benefit right now because we don't have much business logic in here yet. So right now this is just pure overhead. But it will. We're getting there. And now we have edit operation going. So what's left is deleting and validation on this side of the relationships. All right, we'll stop this one here. So we are back at it, and we are finishing up this demo. There's really 3 parts left to go, which is delete. We have the delete operation. We also have a details view. I'll bring in a details view, and then we've got data validation using fluent validation. So details view, delete, and fluent validation. Today we're going to do 2 of the 3, and then we'll finish up fluent validation later. So we are going to do the delete operation. This is an HTTP GET, so we need to get the page first. So we're going to pass the ID in to the delete method. This is going to come from our index view. So on the index view, if we go down to our delete link, you can see we passed the ID in. The ID, lowercase ID, is passed as part of the route.
Are you streaming?
Am I streaming? Probably not. Thank you for... I am now. So here's a nice red delete button. When we click on this delete button, it's going to go to our delete method. That is a GET request. It's going to pass in the ID via the route. It's going to look the book up using the book service get book with authors. So if I go to my book service, this is a method that we've already written. So that should work all the way through the repository and return the book item. And then you send that to the view. So what view is that? Well, that's going to be a delete view. So let's add a view called delete CSHTML. It's going to have a strictly typed book model. A title that says delete the book. And let's just dump the HTML in here. We'll walk through it briefly. Outer div, inner div, a back button. So this is our link that takes us back to the index page. Up at the top. A div underneath that. So upper div, lower div. Here's your lower div. Here's a heading that says delete book. A little flex box here. It's got some SVG icon here. Are you sure you want to delete this book? You cannot undo this. Here is the book title, model title. This loops through the authors and puts the book authors onto the page. So we see the book title, we see the book authors. Here is the button, the red delete book button. A little security anti-forgery token. We're hiding the book ID. Again, you leave that off. A lot of times the post method will need that ID. So if you leave that hidden field off, that won't work. So that's an important hidden field. A cancel button that takes you back to the index, and a submit button. The submit button says delete the book. It runs the delete post on the controller. So back on the controller, we have a post. We take in the ID. This is just a way. Action name of delete versus delete confirmed. Why? Because otherwise the method headers are the same, right? And so you would get the method headers being the same. It would cause a conflict potentially because they both take in it's the same method signature. So I had to name this delete confirmed instead of delete because otherwise I had a conflict. So I said, hey, the action name is delete even though it's a post. Delete confirmed. So here this is saying, hey, use the delete book async on the book service. Of course, that doesn't exist. So as we've done, we need to put the method in the interface first. That takes one ID. Delete book async. Implement the interface. Here's my delete book async method that calls my repository. Delete book async. It's kind of just a wrapper method, if you will. This book repository doesn't have delete async. Delete async is generic enough, we could just write it in repository. So let's bring it into repository. Delete async. Save that. Implement the interface. And where's my delete async right here? I'm going to mark this as virtual async returns a task. Get the ID. If it's not null, remove it and save it. So that should get public async task. There we go. So the controller compiles the book service. Let's just build it. You guys are kind of getting used to the flow if you've been following along. If not, you will be coding the other side of this soon. Let's go ahead and run this and see what breaks. Okay, Gumstead book 20. Clearly something is off. My delete button. We're getting a concurrency error. Let's relaunch and see what's up. Was not expecting that. Although it did delete my book. Interestingly enough, if I click delete, again, I think this is just styling. I think this is an odd styling thing that's going on, because I click that white space and see this? So if I were to clear my cache, if I delete this book, there we go. So add a new book, temp book, create the book, temp book, delete the book, delete the book. So interestingly enough, I'm kind of curious if I go here, networking, I always disable my cache. Nonetheless, it's working. It got a little bit of a CSS issue, which I can spend some time troubleshooting that later. Not to worry for now. Then all that's left would be the details page. So if I go back to my controller, let's get some details. Okay, so this is a book details page. And this is a get method, HTTP get. Okay, get a book with its authors. So the first thing we do is get a book with its authors. Here I get all the authors. So this is the book with its authors. This is getting all the authors. And then populate a book view model, which obviously some of this comes from the book, some of this comes from available authors, comes from all authors. And then the selected authors, we've seen this before. So send that book view model to the view. This is the details view that we need to create. Add a view, details. Book view model. Book details. Let's walk through the markup quickly. Back button, as we just have seen several times. Here's the book's title. The current authors. So we display the current authors of the book, the authors' names. Inside of the author, for each author, you notice a author details. We don't have the author details ready to go yet. That's the other side of this, the author details link. Otherwise it says no authors. Here's a form to update the authors. And here we're looping through all the available authors, putting all the available authors out of the database onto the page, and a button to update the authors. If you click the update authors button, I wonder if it's these SVGs that are getting blocked. I almost wonder. No, that's local. That's not. It's not like we're using some URL here. Never mind. What does this submit button does? This submit button runs the update authors action that needs to be inside of our book controller. So let's see what this looks like. We should have that. We should be able to land on that page before I post the update authors. Okay, so here's Harry Potter. Quite strange. That this is happening on Chrome and not happening on Firefox. Nonetheless, here I can select new authors and click this update authors button. We realize this functionality is not built into the controller. I can also click edit book. That takes me to the edit page that we've already coded. I can also click the delete book. That takes me to the delete book that was also coded. So details kind of does a bunch of different things. You can manage the authors, you can edit the book, you can delete the book, all from details. The only thing that's left is this update authors function. I'll spend a little time today off camera troubleshooting that CSS issue. Let's bring in the post method for update authors. So here's our post, here's our update authors. We bring in the ID. The ID comes from right here. We're passing the ID along as part of the route. We also are using model binding to bring in an array or a list. Underneath the list is an array of selected authors' IDs. Selected author IDs will be passed in because all of these checkboxes has a name of selected author's ID. So this is using model binding to wire up these checkboxes into an array that can be passed into our controller. And because it's an array can be stored as a list, so the data types work. So the IDs being passed in, the author IDs are being passed in. We call the book service, update books. Update book authors, pass in the ID, pass in the list, and redirect you to the details, redirect you to the details get method, right? So this is redirecting you to the get details. And if that works, it looks like it just updates the page and keeps you on that page. And so if I just put all three on these, update it, see, it keeps you on the page. Update the authors. You could tell it's working. Well, if you really want to, update the authors. You see it updates the current authors right here. And then if we go back to books, it maintains those authors. Okay. I'm going to troubleshoot my little CSS issue with Chrome off camera a little bit. And other than that, that's the details and the delete methods I wanted to cover today. So let's see if I can't figure out this CSS issue with a little bit of troubleshooting. Okay. Michael, you've seen this before on your computer. Maybe this is interesting to you because here's the fix. The problem was as I got into it, and I could show the error if I rewind this, but as I went into inspect, I had an error here. Not a favicon error, but it was a cookie error, and it was saying, hey, a cookie was rejected. In other words, the browser was rejecting a cookie from the main site that I'm coding here. And it turns out that if you were running this site in HTTP, Google Chrome really does not like HTTP anymore. Google Chrome really only likes HTTPS. So if you accepted this cookie via HTTP, it was again, it was kind of rejecting that cookie when it was via HTTP. So the solution, clear out your cookies. So I literally go into my settings, and if I search for cookie, delete your browsing history. Okay, so you delete this data. Now, what I did though additionally is under properties, launch settings, there was an HTTP profile for development. So when we're in development, I just deleted this HTTP profile. So step one was to force it into HTTPS in development. And then step two was delete your cookies. And then when you go to the details, now the styling looks good. So those were the couple of steps needed to fix the styling issue. All right, so that's all for today. We'll finish up with validation tomorrow. We are going to finish today, is the goal, with providing data validation at the service layer. Again, kind of big picture. The controller manages HTTP requests and puts and deletes and HTTP responses. So the controller is kind of where the request comes in and manages HTTP flow, if you will. The services layer provides business logic, and one aspect of that is data validation. Other business logic is business rules. Generally speaking, business rules is like, hey, at this Rankin Technical College, tuition cost X amount of dollars, and maybe you get a 10% discount. And you can apply that at the service layer. I don't know, I'm just making something up. But every business has unique rules. What do things cost? What are their discounts? And that's what happens at the service layer. The service layer has business rules. And then you have the repository layer, which manages your database logic. So you access the database via the repository. So we're going to be focusing on data validation in the service layer. Now, one thing I mentioned is this service result class, and I just magic hand over it. I was like, hey, we'll come back to this, and don't worry about it for now. And that's what we did. And then I wanted to offer I wanted to offer an explanation because I had not done that. And so I took some notes. I'm going to share those notes with you. And so the first thing is that, this class is what we've effectively done by using this class is we've implemented what's called a result pattern. The result pattern is interesting because we've learned try-catch blocks, right? In C#, we all learn try-catch, which is structured exception handling. And this is not using exception handling, right? This is not using traditional exception handling as we learned. Instead of throwing exceptions, which are kind of built into the language, right? Built into C#, you just return your own object, right? Again, an argument exception is a class built into C# that is an exception class, and it's built in. Whereas here, we're just going to return our own objects and say, hey, it either worked, this operation worked, or it failed with these reasons. So it's, again, it's not using try-catches. Instead, we're just going to send back an object, and that object is either going to say success, true or false. But if it didn't work, what are the reasons? And so that's what we're implementing here. It says the service result pattern lets your controller handle success and failure uniformly without a bunch of try-catch blocks. So the thing about try-catch blocks is it's not always uniform in that sense. It's got, you could throw this exception or that exception. You got to catch all these different exceptions, and you got to put them in all the different places, right? So you could take a controller and you start adding try-catch blocks and really make it a fat controller again, right? You got a lot of stuff in there. So, now, again, this is a class that represents the outcome. So this is a class that represents the outcome of what's called a service operation. A service operation is any operation you're doing at the service tier, right? So a definition that you need to know is a service operation is any method at the service tier. So in theory, now I didn't actually do this, but in theory, what you could do is every method in your service tier could work with service results. So I'd have to refactor some of the code. Not every method does. I just wrote it in the ones that do data validation. The ones that do data validation is where I use this. Instead of throwing exceptions or returning null, service returns an object to say whether it's success or failed along with any errors. I'm kind of saying the same thing. This pattern makes error handling cleaner and more predictable. So to get into this, right, so we have two classes. One is a standard C# class, and one is a generic implementation of the same class. They're basically the same. One is a standard class, and one is a generic implementation of this class. I will highlight this one, right? This is a auto-implemented property within a init property, right? Instead of the word set, you see the word init. The way that init works is that you can only set the value on initialization when you're creating the object. Okay, so this is just a standard init accessor. This is just a C# thing. This has nothing to do with MVC. But again, you can only set the values during object creation, and then you cannot change them after that. So there's no set block. There's only, this is the keyword init. So this kind of works the same way. So this success, you know, says true or false. Is either successful. The operation was successful, true or false. Okay, if the success is set to false, then you're going to essentially have a list of errors. Now, the next two methods, these are referred to as factory methods because they will create an object. Notice that the OK method returns a new object, and we set the success of true. So this method, this OK method, is referred to as a factory method. Factory methods will create new things, right? They're a method that returns an object. So this, if you call the OK method, we return a new object with the success, a new service result object with the success equal to true. So using this init property to set the success to true. If you call the fail method and pass it in the list of errors, right, then we will generate a new object setting the success to false along with each error in the errors property, right? So it's actually not overly complex. There's two properties, true or false, and a list of errors, and the errors just contain strings, essentially, the strings of error messages. And then here's the generic version of that. So this generic, you know, allows the class to work with any data type like a book or an author. So we can have a service result of books or a service result of authors. And other than that, this is literally the same. This generic has a data property, get and set it. If you run the OK method, we set the success to true. And same kind of ordeal here, these factory methods versus just a data property. Here you pass in a list of errors to the fail method on these fellas. Okay, so a little bit more explanation on this service result class because we're going to use that. Now, ultimately, kind of back to the task at hand is we're going to do data validation, and this is going to be at the service layer. And so if I look at my service layer, we've got some operations, we've got create. So we're going to do data validation at the create layer. So we're going to change this method. And at the edit update book. So these are the two methods. Let me collapse the ones that I'm not going to touch, I think. Okay, so here's my update book async in the book services. Okay, so up at the top, I'm going to bring in Fluent validation. So my students who have used Fluent validation will be familiar with this validation library. So we have to make a validator. So I'm going to make a folder for validators. We already have the validators folder. And let's make a new class called book validator. And let's add using book authors models using fluent validation. We need to inherit from the parent of abstract validator type book. We have a constructor then called book validator. And again, I'm going to keep my validation rules overly simple. All I'm going to do is I'm going to require a book title, so you can't leave it empty, and you can't be more than 200 characters. So these are my very simple book validation logic, which allows me to inject a book validator into my controller and my service results. So in order to do that, we need to register fluent validation. So after my services, I will go ahead and register fluent validation. This will inject all of my validators. And now I need to receive that in my book service. So if I go to book service, here I bring in a book repository. We also need to bring in our validator. Validator of book. We're going to call it validator, and instance field underscore validator equals validator. Now we have this field available for use. Again, I already don't like my code, but nonetheless, you could just directly use validator and skip these fields directly, but whatever. Okay, so now my methods. I guess we could start with create book. When we go to create a book, we can't leave that title blank. We cannot have 200 characters, more than 200 characters. So here we're going to have a validation result, calling it the validation async. Notice this uses this service result pattern because this will return true or false, is it valid? If it's not valid, if validation result is not valid, we return a fail message, a service result of type book, fail. Again, this is the factory method that we showed, and we pass the errors into the fail method. Remember, that's our list of errors. So if the validation result is not valid, otherwise, we know it is valid, and we add the book, and we say return an OK to the controller, right? It's ultimately the controller that's calling this method. So we return an object that's an OK message. Again, going back to the OK message, this is service result type book. So if I go service result right here, service result type book, OK with a book object, and this is what will be returned from that method to the controller. So the controller will have success is true, and it'll have the book data wrapped up in this object. Okay, so in my book controller, here's my post And what we need to do is we just need to handle the error. So here's this result object, but there's a case where the result object has, as I kind of show you here, if it returns a fail method, that fail method will have an error list that we need to put into our view. So back in our books controller, on the create post, we can do this. We could say before we run these update commands, the first thing we're going to do is check the result. If the result is not a success, loop over the errors and add them to model state add model error. Right? This is what the view will use. The view will use this model state object. Right? So populate the errors from the errors collection, and then send a view model back. Basically, this right here will send the view model back to the view, but your model state will have errors. Therefore, in our create view, so go back to our create view, books, create. Here, this span is our validation span, so we should get the error message if we leave that title blank.
Mr. G,
Sir.
can you please explain the line from the last file you were just in?
Let's see, not that one. I was in the controller, I believe. Yep. Which line would you like?
The line 50.
Sure, as this thing's booting up. Line 50. So let's keep in mind what we're doing. We are creating a new book. And so what line 50 does is when you're creating a new book, you're going to allow the user to check boxes for the authors. Those checkboxes have IDs. And so what this method does is updates the book authors with the authors that were selected from the view. Right? So if we dig into that, do you want me to dig into it a little bit?
Yes, please.
Sure. So let's look at the book service, update book authors. Because remember, this created the book. This line right here created the book. So the book itself is created. However, we did not do anything with the authors yet. Right? So the book was created, but this line did not apply the authors. This line adds the authors to the book. And so you can kind of see here, this will send in the book's ID. So what book are we updating? And then this is an array of IDs, ID 1, ID 2, ID 3. And so update book authors async, this is service, book service. And update book authors async. Here you can see we really just call the repository, we just pass it through to the repository. So if I go to the book repository, here's update book authors async. We remove all the authors, and then we read the individual authors out of the database, loop over the authors, and add each author to the book. So this is really an important, I'm glad you asked, because this is a really important line in this many-to-many relationship, how I handle adding authors to a book and vice versa. This is a really important chunk of code to work with many-to-many relationships. Was that helpful?
Yes, it was. Thank you.
You're welcome. Back to my validation, let's just go to add a book and let's see if we create a book. There you get the simple title is required. It's not, again, the actual working example is not impressive, but we are implementing all these additional layers, right, that makes everything very, modular and testable and kind of a ideal architecture. And Lord knows if I copy and paste that a bunch of times, you cannot exceed 200 characters. Okay, so on the controller, that was create. Now let's do edit. So book service. You could see AI is picking up on, hey, I'm probably going to want to update my book async. Let's bring in, this is really different. This code suggestion, it's like different coloring. I can hover over it. What happens if I just click? It picked up on the pattern I wanted to use. I'm using my same validator on an update book. And oh, wait a minute. Of course, I need to, you just can't update the service. See, I just wanted to jump in too quick. Let me also update the controller. Right? So here's my controller. And just as I did before, I need to write in a little bit of logic. If the result is not a success, add the errors to the model state. Right? Just a little bit of additional controller code. And it's really nice with these AI toolings is they can pick up your coding patterns and how you like to code and just make small tweaks. So we've updated the controller. We've updated the service. Notice the return data type is a task of service result. So we're either wrapping up an OK message or a fail message. It's also the case, like up here, we're using the generic implementation of it, and down here, I'm not using the generic implementation for it. Just pointing that out, but nonetheless, both should work. Click edit. I delete. Okay, the title field is required. Title cannot exceed 200 characters. Okay. So this is one half, and I would say a lot of the legwork has been done, on this project. This is one half. CRUD operations on the book half of the many-to-many relationship. The lab assignment for you guys is to do the same thing on the author side. So just these same kind of operations, CRUD operations on authors. Create a new author, right? And just as we add a book, you can select your authors. Well, when you create your author, you can select your books. Right? When you edit a book, you can select your authors. When you edit an author, you can select your books. Right? So this is half the lab, not for this week. I'll assign this lab next week for you guys, but this will be an upcoming lab for you guys. this is your starter code. I will get this pushed onto GitHub so you guys can start by either cloning or forking this repo. And that's your starter point for this code. That way you've got a whole lot of the groundwork started for you. All right, but that's half of this app. So I'm going to go ahead and stop it here and let you guys get started on your labs today.